In 1974, Canada changed its tax code to make 100% of investment into certified Canadian films tax-free. Now, this is a fairly standard incentive program, and you'd be surprised, in fact, what movies down the years have been made as a tax shelter. These investments in Canada had previously been 60% tax deductible. Bumping that up to 100% opened the door for a lot of new Canadian films. I guess that's exactly what the intention was. Of course, a lot of these movies were not very good. This probably wasn't exactly the plan, but it turns out that making a movie for tax purposes doesn't always produce the best results. A lot of these movies were amateurish and rushed because they had to meet various tax deadlines. A lot of these movies, including this one, for instance, were made right at the end of the year. Anyway, one person who benefited from this program was David Cronenberg. He took the opportunity to make some really weird movies. I will probably make a video about his first movie, Shivers, but today we're skipping a few to look at Scanners, which was his first film to get significant traction in the United States, and which was a tax shelter film. Let me mention two things about the cast and the crew. Patrick McGoohan is in this movie. He's the guy from the British television show The Prisoner. He produced and created that show as well as starring in it. He was also a close friend of Peter Falk, and he helped out a bunch with Columbo. He directed, wrote, produced some of those episodes. Of course, he's much older in this movie. He's no longer a prisoner, thankfully. I think he probably has the best performance in the movie, although apparently he was pretty hard to work with. Some of the acting in this movie is not amazing, but it kind of works with the odd tone and the strange characters. Howard Shore scored Scanners. Try saying that 10 times fast. These days, he's best known for The Lord of the Rings, but his career actually started right alongside David Cronenberg's, and to this day, he has worked on every single David Cronenberg movie except for one. Can you name which one? I haven't seen the new Cronenberg film, The Shrouds, yet. I'm hoping to watch it, maybe do a video about it, but Howard Shore did do the music for that. Of course, I do have videos about Crimes of the Future and Existence, and Howard Shore did the music for those as well. Anyway, there are some other interesting people in this movie, like Stephen Lack, who quit acting to become a painter, but I'm not going to get too bogged down in biography. Most of the cast here is Canadian, because, of course, this is a certified Canadian film. I'll tell you right now that Scanners is a signature David Cronenberg movie, much like almost every other David Cronenberg movie, but it's not quite his best. There are signs of this being kind of an early movie. For instance, it's more oriented towards action and horror. It's more oriented towards being a cult movie. I guess you might say, well, wait a minute, all Cronenberg movies are cult films. Sort of, but I think a lot of his movies have substantial depth to them, a lot of subtext. There maybe isn't quite as much going on here, although there's some, and I'll talk about it. This movie, for instance, doesn't have much of a libidinal angle, which is kind of a hallmark of a lot of other Cronenberg movies, including some movies that came before Scanners, like Shivers. I think you can tell that this movie was a little bit rushed. Cronenberg apparently didn't know how the movie was going to end when he was shooting the beginning. He was writing and shooting the movie at the same time, and it shows. In some ways, Scanners is built around a really elegant dramatic device. This movie is about people with telepathic powers called scanners. This is not about office technology, sadly. And the scanners can do things like read other people's minds, standard telepathic behavior, but they can also enter into someone else's mind and make them do something, like drive their car off of a bridge. This really opens the door for some 4D chess. It's a cool mechanic, and as the movie introduces this mechanic, shows us these angles, you think, this is going to be pretty fun. The dramatic logic of the film is going to be different. The rules are going to be different. Unfortunately, I think the movie ends up being slightly too loose to fully capitalize on this. There are some really clever parts, but this isn't exactly a clockwork movie, and there are some pretty big inconsistencies here and there, and a couple of plot holes. There's also an interesting downside to this mechanic, which is that when two scanners are fighting each other, there isn't much to see. You kind of just have two people thinking really hard at each other. There's a couple notable exceptions to that, but either way, it's safe to say that the action in this movie is unconventional, which has its ups and downs. In some ways, it's pretty cool. In other ways, it's a little bit goofy. Scanners is definitely an unpredictable movie. It even ends on a delightfully unconventional note. I really enjoyed watching this. I think this is, compared to some of these other tax shelters movies, you can really tell that Cronenberg was destined to go on and do incredible things. In very difficult circumstances, he made a really cool movie. Even if it's not peak Cronenberg, it is pretty remarkable what he put together. Hey, at the very least, it's fun to watch. Apparently, it was not fun to make this movie. On the first day of filming, the crew was involved in a fatal car accident. With an onlooker who was watching the filming apparently slammed into the back of a truck they were using in the scene. Not a great omen for the film. They also struggled to find good locations to shoot the movie. They were looking for futuristic locations, I guess. This movie has a lot of brutalism in it. If you watch it today, these buildings seem old, not futuristic, but I don't think that's necessarily a flaw. The movie starts out in a food court at a mall. For me, this triggered a deep, deep memory of going to Seattle Center when I was a child and eating in some food court there. Well, not really eating in it, but just walking through, I think. Anyway, this particular location doesn't matter too much, but this movie, like most Cronenberg movies, is really in tune with a certain emerging modern thing, the future and all its grim implications. Brutalism kind of feels in line with that. The mall food court kind of feels right for that. Watching this movie partly feels like looking back, and it partly feels like looking forward. I mentioned that Scanners doesn't have as much subtext as something like Videodrome or Crash, but there's still a lot going on here. This is a corporate movie. It turns out that these scanners are mainly being pursued by shady defense contractors and chemical companies. The film's plot really turns on corporate machinations. That's something that doesn't feel too dated. The choice of companies here is telling. Some sort of defense contractor and some sort of chemical company, both huge and faceless. Even as one of these companies seems to be the good guys, you get the feeling that they aren't exactly to be trusted. They aren't on the level. There's something here that maybe isn't quite real. Cronenberg loses some points for technological literacy, or illiteracy, I should say, but it was 1981 and it was Canada. There's a computer at the center of the film. At one point, this is kind of what I'm getting at, and there's a scene where one of the scanners uses their powers to read the mind of the computer through a telephone, through a payphone, in fact. I'm not sure that this is entirely realistic, but it hints at another big Cronenberg theme, which is some sense of latent information, a haphazard interconnectedness, some sense of the public and the private being intermingled, the public being broadcast out for everybody to see. Broadcasting is a theme in a lot of these movies. Think about Videodrome, for instance, where some guys at a television station are trying to find interesting broadcasts on unused frequencies, secret broadcasts of some kind. In Scanners, there's no need for a big satellite because you can jump straight into each other's heads, at least the scanners can. One of the mechanics that Cronenberg uses to convey telepathy is to feature a lot of different voices. Sometimes you hear the internal monologue, like the internal voice of other characters, and that sort of represents telepathy. Sometimes after someone is scanned, they seem to be able to hear a really strange, garbled voice in their heads. It's a little bit inconsistent, actually, but these voices are maybe pointing, again, to this latent information. I think a pretty common claim about this movie is that it has some proto-internet anxiety. Of course, a lot of David Cronenberg movies feel like they're about the internet, but before the internet. Very prophetic in some ways. This anxiety of the information age is pointed to fairly directly by the scene with the computer, of course. And, the computer is being accessed over the telephone. Maybe this is a bridge to this thing I was talking about with the voices a second ago. Don't worry, I'm not too young to have experienced dial-up, so there is obviously some connection between the internet and telephones, although this movie still isn't exactly realistic the way that it draws those things together. Okay, a couple more things to talk about. I mentioned already that a chemical company, a drug company, is at the center of the film. What's the difference between a chemical company and a drug company? Here, the company is called Biocarbon Amalgamate. Super vague name. The company seems to efface any difference between chemicals and drugs. I think of drugs maybe as being something for humans, medicine, something like that, whereas chemicals are more industrial. I don't think that's a real definition. Here, the lines are really blurred. Biocarbon Amalgamate could make toothpaste or nuclear missiles. It's not just the name, but the way the business is run looks like that. The security around the facilities. They could make toothpaste, or they could be overthrowing the government of a Central American company It's not exactly clear. Again, some hint at the loss of the personal, at the industrialization of the individual, something like that. It's also crucial that this company has a lot to do with the scanners. One thing you see over and over again in this movie is sedation, which is another interesting postmodern idea. Sedation via the drugs produced by some of these companies, and yeah, it's interesting that this movie has such a clear opinion on how mind is shaped by corporations. This movie has an opinion on who's going to be shaping the future of the human mind. It's going to be the big corporations. Of course, you might think about the opioid epidemic, but there are more subtle ways in which our brains have been rewired by big companies. Like I said, I don't think this movie has quite as much substance or quite as much force as something like Videodrome, but it is hair-raising. It gets some points for the usual Cronenberg stuff. I really enjoyed Scanners. In some ways, though, it just made me long to rewatch some of Cronenberg's other works. And maybe I'm going to do exactly that. So you might expect to see a couple more of this guy's movies on the channel in the near future.